The Ross Kaminsky Show.
You're a great American.
Now, Ross Kaminsky.
Come on, man.
On Denver's talk station, 630 KHOW.
All right, good morning. It's Thursday. It's my favorite day of the week, and thanks so much for starting with me. I'm a little bleary-eyed today because I woke up at like 1:50 or something with a lot of like stomach pain, and it was probably just needing to go to the bathroom. But anyway, it's hard to get back to bed. So I've been up most of the time. I know that's too much information to start your day, right? I've been up most of the time since about 1:50, but I feel like I'm doing all right. And we've got, do we have a heck of a show planned for you today, including, I'll just tell you, my 8 o'clock hour guests, Ben Shapiro at 8:05. I think you all know who Ben Shapiro is, and his book that I'm holding in my hands. If you're watching, I'm apparently, according to DJ Shannon, we're live on YouTube right now. So if you go to youtube.com and type in Ross Kaminsky, you can see what I look like when I don't shave for a week and a half. But Ben's book is called The Authoritarian Moment, and it's very, very good. I've read the whole thing. And I've, marked a bunch of pages that have things I might want to ask about. But there's this one particular concept in here that he describes called renormalization that I think is fascinating and important and kind of a really good frame through which to view what's happening in America, what's been happening in America with the rampant spread, like this pandemic of radical leftist stuff, like how many people got on board with defund the police and how many people are on board with cancel culture and on and on and on, when you know that these are things that not very many Americans actually support, and yet they've become dominant. So we're going to talk with Ben about that. And Ben is not the tallest dude in the world, but he's a lot taller than our 8:35 guest, Brad Williams, who we've had in studio lots of times before. A little person, midget dwarf.
A midget on a scooter!
Exactly. Who is going to join me in studio. He's back in town playing at Comedy Works this weekend. There's still some tickets available if you want to go to comedyworks.com. I will note that just because of the way things are going around here, Comedy Works has put in a policy where to be let in to sit down, you either have to show proof of vaccination or a negative COVID test within the previous 48 hours. I'm sure that's not their idea of a good time, but that, so be it. And I imagine a lot of the comedians will prefer to work in a place where that's the policy. But I'm actually going to go see Brad this weekend at Comedy Works, and I encourage you to do the same. Now, we got some big stuff to talk about here. Some local crime, I guess, is going to be the topic of the opening segment of today's show. I suppose that's how we can think about it. So first, we learned yesterday what was coming out of the grand jury proceedings regarding the Elijah McClain situation. And I think most people know what happened there, but a couple of years ago, 23-year-old Elijah McClain was walking down the road. Someone called the cops and said there was a suspicious-looking person. I don't know whether that was just walking while black that made him suspicious, but it might not have been just that, because he had a mask on his face. He had a mask on his face because he suffered from anemia, and it made him feel cold a lot of the time. So he would often wear a lot of stuff to warm himself up, even in conditions where other people would not have felt the need to do that. So the cops rolled up on him, and he's, I guess he went to take the earbuds out of his ear, and the cops got real aggressive with him, and it turned into almost a George Floyd kind of thing, but it's not exactly the same. It's a little more complicated. So he was put in a carotid hold, a choke hold, put down on the ground, said, "I can't breathe," never acted violent in any way. And then they called the paramedics, and the paramedics injected him with ketamine to settle him down. He had a heart attack and died shortly after that. And it's also worth noting that apparently the paramedics overestimated McClain's weight and thereby gave him too high a dose of ketamine. The other thing that's a little different about this story, and I guess some people have tried to do the same thing with the George Floyd thing, right? There were some people who tried to claim that he died because of the drugs in his system, which in my opinion is obviously not true. But in this case, there weren't drugs in his system, but the way that this is a tricky story is that it seems kind of unclear from the medical record whether the medical examiner is saying the death was caused by the brutal actions of the cops or what the paramedics did or some combination. And it's going to make this a rather difficult trial, I think. Let me go to the Colorado Sun. Colorado's statewide grand jury has returned a 32-count indictment against, it's a total of 5 people, right? 3 police officers and 2 paramedics. They were each charged with 1 count of manslaughter and 1 count of criminally negligent homicide. It's a pretty aggressive charge. And the paramedics were charged with second-degree assault, including assault with a deadly weapon, and they are calling the ketamine itself a deadly weapon. The 3 officers who were indicted, their names are Nathan Woodyard, Jason Rosenblatt, and Randy Rodema. Rosenblatt, according to the Colorado Sun, was fired from the Aurora Police Department last year after he responded ha-ha to a text-messaged image of other officers reenacting a neck hold like the one police used on McClain. The whole story is ugly, right? I mean, the kid was walking home from a convenience store carrying iced tea. Didn't Trayvon Martin go to the store to buy iced tea? That was a different situation, though. He was listening to music using earbuds, and like I said, he was wearing a black mask because he was frequently cold, even though it wasn't a cold night. The other thing that's going to make this trial a little bit more interesting is that Adams County, in 2019, the DA there did not charge any of the first responders involved in the encounter with McClain. Then Governor Polis, and here's how the Colorado Sun puts it, facing renewed pressure following social justice protests in Colorado and across the nation last year, appointed Weiser's office to serve as a special prosecutor and review the case for potential criminal prosecution. It was an unprecedented move. Then in January, Weiser opened a grand jury investigation. The panel has subpoena power, is made of people from across the Denver metro area. The grand jury can have as many as 23 members, but no more than a quarter of them may be from any one county. The members of the grand jury's identities are kept strictly confidential, and they are selected by a judge in consultation with lawyers from the Attorney General's office. So, you've got 3 police officers. Let's just distinguish this from George Floyd for a minute. You've got 3 police officers rather than 1 who got their hands on McClain. And then you've got 2 paramedics. And they are all charged. Now, just thinking about this from the point of view of a juror, Think about how difficult it's going to be to prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt. Beyond a reasonable doubt, if the cops say that the paramedics killed him, and the paramedics say that the cops killed him. That's going to be tough, right? That's going to be very tough. But you know that they say a grand jury can indict a ham sandwich. Remember that at a grand jury, all they hear is the prosecutor's side. They do not hear anything even vaguely like a defense. And if a prosecutor is bound and determined to indict someone, then someone's going to get indicted. And I'm not saying that Phil Weiser put his finger on the scale here. I doubt he did that. But you don't know. His office said he was too busy today, overwhelmed with stuff, to join us on the show. But he will join us on the show soon. Since there's still a trial to come, it is unlikely that he could or would say much anyway about the McClain situation. Now, I want to do one thing here. I want to share with you. Actually, no, I'm gonna do something else here. You all know former district attorney George Brauchler, whose district included much of Aurora. When this happened, this was handled by the Adams County DA, that part of Aurora. So it wasn't in George's district, but George has had to handle quite a lot of difficult cases during his time as DA. And George, thanks for joining me on short notice. And I wanted to know what you thought of what we learned yesterday about a total of 32 charges against 5 different people coming out of the grand jury yesterday.
There were some surprises in the indictment, for sure, and I read through the entire indictment, at least what was made publicly available. There's some interesting things there. I think what folks ought to know is out of 32 counts, those aren't really 32 separate charges. A good number of them are sentence enhancer charges called crime of violence charges. And if you break it down, roughly there are 3 charges per police officer, so 9 total, and then 2/3 of the indictment itself is really just against the paramedics for various versions of culpability for the death and injuries to Elijah McClain. There's just some interesting things that jumped out. So, for instance, some of the charges involve the alleged use of ketamine as a deadly weapon.
Right.
That is remarkably creative. I've never seen anything like that again. Usually, if you ever see some substance being used that way, if it wasn't a poison, it was someone trying to non-consensually cause someone to go into a stupor so that you could commit another crime on them, like a date rape drug or something like that. I've never seen anything like this where a paramedic who is using a lawful substance, and ketamine was at the time, in 4 situations like this, have been accused of using it in a manner that would cause it to be a deadly weapon. And that's important because that's what gives you the sentence enhancer. There's also, and I may have missed it in the indictment, but I don't think so, the allegations of serious bodily injury aren't your traditional serious bodily injury, the impairment of an organ, the breaking of a bone. It's things like cerebral hypoxia, which is what happens when you have that carotid chokehold put on you. And in fact, I think it's the purpose of the carotid chokehold is to cause you to lose consciousness by depriving your brain of this, that, and the other. So very creative charges in that way. There are another couple things that jumped out to me that I thought were odd. There's nothing new in this indictment that wasn't known previously, with only 2 exceptions. There are 2 unnamed expert witnesses, and that's also bizarre, by the way. It's not that it's wrong, it's just bizarre. Like, we name the witnesses in our indictments that we have. And this one talks about an ER doctor who's going to say that the paramedics were wrong for using ketamine in the manner in which they used it. And then there's another unnamed forensic pathologist who said, I declare that the cause of death is some combination of the force used by the officers as well as the ketamine that was administered. What's interesting to me about that is you don't need a grand jury to get those two pieces of evidence. Those two pieces of evidence a regular investigator could get by finding those people and saying, hey, can you come in and make a statement or we'll write a report or whatever. So I struggle to see inside the indictment what the purpose of using the grand jury was. Like there's no highlighting of, and we got this testimony, or we were able to secure these documents, which let us. There's just nothing like that. So it's an unusual indictment from that standpoint.
My guess, George, and you understand this stuff obviously way better than I do, so you can tell me if I'm way off base. My guess is that he used the indictment to try to, the grand jury to try to avoid the appearance of a politically motivated prosecution just brought directly by his office.
Potentially, perhaps, but I think in some ways it also makes this seem a bit political or weak in a way, because you just don't use a grand jury that way. You don't use a grand jury to say, I know I could make the decision, but it's more advantageous for optics if you do it. That's just not the proper use of a grand jury. But
let me jump in. We just have a couple minutes, and I have a couple questions I want to ask you.
Sure.
Do you think that each person here gets a separate trial? Do you think the cops are tried in one and the paramedics in another? Do you think all five are tried together? Because it occurs to me that if I were the indicted people, I would at least want to split the cops and the paramedics if I were the defense, and then have the cops say the paramedics did it, and have the paramedics say the cops did it, and then neither side gets, a charge proved against them beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I think for sure the cops would want to be separate from the paramedics, with the argument that, look, we couldn't foresee that these paramedics would misjudge this guy as being as large as Hulk Hogan and pump him full of enough ketamine to cause bad things to happen. We're not on the hook for that. We couldn't foresee it, didn't make it happen. Couldn't stop it because we didn't know what was going on. We're not good for his death. But whether or not they're each individually entitled to a trial is really going to come down to whether or not statements of those other people participating in this crime are going to be attempted to be used against them. And with the body cams the way they are, I think that's an open question as to whether that happens. And so you just can't admit in hearsay statements of another co-defendant in a case against a person like, if you were on trial, unless they're going to agree to it. Otherwise, you'd have to keep all that evidence out, or they're going to have these separate trials. It's a very, very, in my opinion, very challenging case. The last odd thing I'd tell you, man, is what's charged is manslaughter and criminally negligent homicide. Well, that's like charging first-degree murder and second-degree murder because it's a lesser included.
Right.
It's not like it's already built into the manslaughter charge. You just don't see that. You just don't see indictments or information saying, we're going to charge you with stealing $1,000 and we're going to charge you with stealing $400. You just don't see that. So it's just interesting. A lot of this is driven by whatever they threw in front of the grand jury, but it's also really guided by the prosecution. And so I'm anxious to see what additional evidence comes out of it, because right now it's kind of a bare bones indictment, and I just don't see what that smoking gun is, for lack of a better term, that changes the analysis from what Dave Young went through. Maybe it's there, and we'll find it.
Yeah.
But very interesting indictment.
It's just, we've only got about a minute. Stepping back from the law and just speaking as a citizen, when I read the story, when I, understand the story reasonably well, I do think that what the police officers did was probably criminal. What the paramedics did was probably negligent. I don't know about criminal in the same way that I mean it against the police officers, but my gut instinct is that this is a much harder case to get guilty verdicts on than George Floyd.
I think that's true. I think a couple of things you said are super insightful. One is, and I don't want anybody to come away from this interview feeling something differently about my opinion. I think that Elijah McClain is completely innocent and that he's alive, but for that contact with law enforcement that night, I have no doubts in my mind about that. Zero. That, however, is a far cry from saying the conduct that led to his death is prosecutable as a crime in a Colorado court. I think we're on the verge of potentially criminalizing medical malpractice by the paramedics if that's what was engaged in. We've never seen that before. I think the officers in this case, if they're good for a crime, it's probably in that assault range. And that's the other thing you should know, is that the manslaughter and criminally negligent homicide charges are probation-eligible low-level charges. The second-degree assault charge is the one that carries the promise of 5 to 16 years of prison. It's actually the big hammer in this case. So just very interesting. It'll be interesting to see how it develops.
George Brauchler, former 18th Judicial District DA, thanks for your time. Thanks for joining me on short notice.
Anytime, Ross. Talk to you soon. Bye now.
Bye. All right. When we come back, I was sent something by a parent of a fight at East High School in Denver that is really shocking, and we got to talk about it right after this.
KHOW Denver, 630 KHOW, an iHeartRadio station. Available everywhere on our free iHeartRadio app.